He stood at the head of the board table and told everyone my grandfather had ever trusted that I lacked the instincts for real business. 3 years later, he was calling my cell from the parking lot of that same building, voice stripped of its usual ease, reaching for something that sounded almost careful, asking whether there was any chance I might consider coming back. I want to be precise about the phrasing. He didn't say, "Would you consider?" He said, "Any chance." It's a specific kind of question, the kind a person uses when they believe the honest answer is no, and they're making an appeal to something they think sits above fairness. History, maybe. Obligation. The particular guilt that comes from watching something you love dissolve, and knowing you have the means to stop it. I let him finish. Then I told him to email me the last 2 quarterly statements and the most current balance sheet. Not as a yes, just as a place to start. My name is Camille Auger. The company, Auger & Sons Fine Foods, was my grandfather's creation, built from a converted dairy facility he'd leased in the East End of Hamilton, Ontario in 1974. He started it on a philosophy that turned out to be 20 years ahead of its time. That Canadian restaurants and independent retailers wanted access to quality regional products, and that what stood between those products and those buyers was someone willing to build the logistics to connect them. He built that infrastructure one account at a time over 30 years. By the time he handed the company to my father, it had 3 distribution facilities, contracts with over 200 accounts across Ontario and Quebec, and a reputation that had taken decades to earn, and that the industry treated accordingly. The Sons in the name was always more aspiration than reality. My grandfather had a son and a daughter. The son was my father, who came into the business in his late 20s and spent the next 2 decades making it larger and more stable than my grandfather had imagined possible. The daughter was my aunt, who built a different kind of life. Teaching first, then a family, and who married, when she was in her early 30s, a man my grandfather had met twice before the wedding and assessed once. I don't know the exact terms of that assessment. I know that he never changed the company's legal structure to formalize my uncle's role within it. My uncle had the patience to work around that. He wasn't obvious about it. He never announced intentions. He simply appeared. At board meetings, at supplier events, at industry functions he wasn't technically invited to but found reasons to attend, and accumulated the specific currency of presence. He knew names, he remembered details. He asked questions that sounded like engagement but committed him to nothing. He was in the way that matters most in a family company, always in the room. My father managed this with a deliberateness I only understood in hindsight. He kept my uncle informed without giving him authority. He included him in peripheral conversations while protecting the decisions that mattered. He believed, I think, that managed proximity was safer than open exclusion. That an uncle feeling sidelined would become an uncle with grievances, and that an uncle with grievances in a family business is a problem that never resolves cleanly. So he kept him inside the tent and managed the radius. When my father died, a cardiac event sudden on a Tuesday morning in early November 3 years ago, the tent collapsed. He was 61 and believed he had time. There was no written succession plan. There was intention. He had spoken with me many times about what the company should grow into, about the role he imagined me stepping into fully. None of it had been formalized. In the weeks after his death, while I was still making arrangements and returning calls from clients who wanted to express condolences in the way of people who were also quietly asking whether the accounts would hold, my uncle was having a different set of conversations entirely. I was 31. I had been VP of Operations for 2.5 years, a role I'd moved into after working through the company's regional accounts division and spending 18 months with a food industry consultancy in Mississauga. I knew the vendor contracts. I knew the carrier relationships and the specific pressure points in each. I knew which clients required a personal phone call during a disruption, and which preferred a clean email with the resolution already attached. I had renegotiated 3 major freight agreements the year before my father died, agreements that produced meaningful annualized savings, and that the operations team treated as templates going forward. When something went wrong in the distribution chain, the team called me. When clients had escalations, they asked for me by name. What I didn't know how to do, and I've had to be honest with myself about this, even in retrospect, was manage a board. My father had done that. I had watched it, absorbed pieces of it, but I hadn't understood that governance in a family business is its own separate discipline with its own preparation required. And my uncle had spent a decade studying that discipline while I was learning operations. The board meeting happened in January, 6 weeks after my father's funeral. It was framed as a leadership continuity session. Standard, procedural. I attended. My uncle attended. Several long-standing board members attended, along with two newer members I knew less well, who I would later learn had been cultivated by my uncle over the previous 2 years, through working sessions and lunches I hadn't been invited to and hadn't thought to ask about. My uncle spoke at length. He spoke about margin pressure and carrier volatility, and the need for leadership capable of making clear-eyed decisions quickly. He spoke about the importance of separating operational knowledge from executive judgment, framing them as different categories, as if knowing the business deeply were somehow a liability when it came to running it. He said, with a rehearsed reluctance that I recognized only after the fact, that he admired everything I had built in my role. He said the company needed someone who could make hard calls without sentiment clouding the outcome. He looked at me while he said this with the expression of someone who wants to appear generous, even while taking something from you. He had spoken to every board member individually in the weeks before that meeting. I understood this afterward, when I compared notes with the one director, who later told me what she'd observed. He had framed his concerns differently with each of them. Operational continuity with some, financial stability with others, board independence with the ones for whom that framing landed most effectively. By the time I was given the floor to respond, I was arguing against a conclusion the room had already reached before I walked in. 3 weeks later, I received a document in the mail, a bylaw amendment quietly filed with the provincial registry, restructuring the board's operational committee. My name had been removed from the governance table. I had not been present for the vote. I had not been notified that a vote was taking place. I discovered this because the amendment notice arrived at my home address as a courtesy copy, addressed not to a participant but to an interested party. My cousin, who handled accounts receivable and called me sometimes out of loyalty and sometimes out of something closer to guilt, told me later that she'd learned about it from overhearing a conversation in the hallway near the boardroom. I drove home along the QEW that evening and sat in my apartment for a long time without turning on any lights. Not as a performance of grief, I just needed the quiet. I had felt something like this assembling for months, had watched the shape of it form piece by piece, and had managed to hope I was reading it wrong. There is a particular exhaustion that arrives when the thing you feared has happened anyway, and you realize the energy you spent dreading it provided no protection. I applied for positions in Toronto the following week. Within 6 weeks, I had accepted a role with a food operations consulting firm. 9 people, an office above a dry cleaners near Bloor and Ossington, work that required genuine technical knowledge and delivered no status whatsoever. I took it without hesitation. What I needed was a room where my last name meant nothing, and my work had to earn its own credibility from scratch. Over the 3 years that followed, I built a different record. I completed my CPA designation in evenings and on weekends. I took every advanced food safety certification the Canadian Food Inspection Agency offered in my sector. I did a course in supply chain analytics that changed the way I read financial statements, not as summaries of performance, but as terrain maps, showing where a business was under pressure and where it was attempting to obscure that pressure from the people who should see it. I learned to read a balance sheet the way my grandfather used to read a shipping manifest. Backward first, for the gaps between what was being claimed and what the numbers actually showed. I told myself this was career development. It was. What it also was, and I didn't admit this to myself cleanly until the second year, was preparation. My uncle had told a board that I was too shaped by legacy to see the business clearly. What I understood, working through those programs, was that the only thing that would answer that argument was a documented record so thorough it left no room for the emotional characterization. Not anger, not grievance. Just sourced, dated, verifiable fact. There were nights when I came close to picking up the phone, a dozen of them, maybe, across those 3 years. Moments when something I'd found in a public filing or a court record made the picture sharper, and the pull toward the immediate felt overwhelming. Each time, I made the deliberate choice to wait. Not because patience felt natural. It didn't, particularly in the first year, but because I understood that acting prematurely would give my uncle exactly what he needed. A version of me that was reactive rather than prepared. A case built on grievance rather than evidence. He had already written that story once, in a boardroom where I was present, and I was not going to hand him the materials to write it again. My cousin called every few weeks. I had asked her clearly not to send me anything internal. No documents, no system data, nothing that could be characterized later as solicited confidential information. But she talked. The way people talk when something is sitting on them and they need to say it to someone who will understand. She mentioned once, almost as an aside, that the company had drawn a second line of credit against the Burlington warehouse. She mentioned months later that 3 senior account managers, people with tenure going back to my father's time, had left within 18 months and been replaced by individuals connected to a freight logistics company my uncle had prior dealings with. People, she said, who didn't understand the difference between a standing account and a spot order, which in food distribution is a distinction that costs real money when you get it wrong consistently and at volume. She mentioned a CFEA compliance notice in the public regulatory database, a consequence of inspection findings at the Hamilton facility, the first such notice in the company's history. She mentioned that suppliers were calling accounts payable about invoices in the 60 to 90-day range that had previously cleared in 30. She mentioned that my uncle had moved from daily presence at the facility to twice weekly, to something more intermittent that the long-term staff found disorienting. I filed all of it. I continued tracking the company's public filings on CDAR. I watched the pattern clarify. Then I contacted Preethi Selvakumar. We had met during my CPA program, she'd guest lectured on forensic applications of financial analysis, and we'd stayed loosely in touch since. She had since built a practice in Waterloo focused on private company financial reviews. I was explicit with her. Everything she worked with had to come from publicly available sources. Provincial corporate registries, court filings, regulatory databases, industry supplier records accessible through public channels. I needed something that could be presented to a board or referred to a regulatory body without questions about how it had been obtained. If there was nothing there, I needed to know that clearly. If there was something there, I needed it to be unimpeachable. 4 months later, she asked me to come to her office. Approximately $2.8 million in company liabilities had been restructured through service contracts with a freight brokerage incorporated in Alberta. The company appeared on paper to provide logistics coordination to food distributors. A review of its beneficial ownership structure, derivable from the Alberta Corporate Registry and from documents filed in a related civil action in British Columbia, revealed that partial ownership rested with my uncle's brother, a man I had met perhaps 5 times. A man whose company, as Preethi documented across 42 pages, appeared to have produced no services in the food distribution sector that were commensurate with the fees it had received. The structure wasn't embezzlement in any clean, chargeable sense. It was something more careful than that. Related party contracts approved at above-market rates, logged as legitimate operating expenses, insulated by enough layers of corporate distance to require professional forensic work to trace. The board hadn't been complicit in any active way. They had been managed, directed toward questions that made sense, and steered away from the ones that would have required looking at vendor relationships in a way that would have been uncomfortable for my uncle to explain. Boards are often effective at not seeing things when the person briefing them has an interest in the blind spot remaining. I read Preethi's report twice in her office. I took it home and read it twice more over the following weekend. Then I set it aside for 2 weeks. I want to be honest about what those 2 weeks were. They weren't strategy. They were a reckoning with my own motives. I had spent 3 years telling myself I was building a case for the company's benefit. For the employees, the vendors, the clients, the reputation my grandfather had created. That was true. It was also true that I wanted my uncle to understand, in the most documented and irrefutable way available, that he had been wrong about me. I needed to sit with the fact that both of those things were real before I could act from the right place. What moved me in the end was not my uncle's face in that boardroom. It was my cousin calling from her car on a Tuesday evening, keeping her voice low because she didn't want to risk being overheard in the building. 11 staff members had been quietly advised to update their employment situations. The RBC credit line was coming up for renewal in 60 days, and the bank had already communicated that existing terms would not be available under the company's current financial profile. Vendors were talking in the industry, not loudly yet, but in specialty food distribution, the community is genuinely small, and those conversations compound quickly. The reputation that had taken 3 generations to establish was beginning to erode in ways that would outlast whatever my uncle eventually walked away from. That was the moment I stopped waiting. I didn't contact my uncle. I had thought carefully about this. I knew what would happen if I did. He would manage the conversation the way he had managed the board meeting, with calibrated pacing and strategic reframing, and I would have exchanged whatever leverage I'd built for a conversation that left him forewarned and me with nothing to show for it. I drove to Guelph on a Saturday morning instead. My grandfather's original business partner was in his late 70s, retired, living with his wife in a house with a vegetable garden that took up most of the backyard. He had sold his shares back to the family years earlier, but had never entirely detached from the company's history. He had known me since I was young enough to sit under the packing tables during Christmas inventory, which I mention because it matters. He understood what this company meant in a way that no one currently on the board could fully replicate. He read Preethi's report at his kitchen table while I drank tea. He wore reading glasses and went slowly, without rushing, turning back to certain sections twice. When he finished, he folded his glasses and set them on top of the binder. "Your father suspected something like this was forming," he said. "He didn't know the mechanism, but he could feel the direction." He made 3 phone calls from the kitchen phone that afternoon. One to an independent board director who had been with the company since my grandfather's time, and who, I learned later, had her own concerns she hadn't found a way to raise formally. One to the company's external auditor. One to the corporate lawyer, who had been noting the pace of bylaw amendments accumulating in the provincial registry, with what she later described as professional unease. An emergency board session was scheduled for the following Wednesday. I was not asked to attend. I didn't need to be. Preethi's report was in the room, and the people in that room were finally being asked questions they couldn't answer without looking at the thing they'd been directed away from. My cousin called me Wednesday evening. 2 outside directors had moved to request my uncle's resignation as CEO, pending an independent forensic audit of all vendor relationships involving related parties. He could step back voluntarily or have the matter referred to the appropriate provincial and federal authorities. He chose to step back. He appeared at my apartment door 4 days later. He was well-dressed, as always. The composure he'd spent years cultivating was still in place, but it was working harder now. I could see the effort of it in the way he stood. "You've been building toward this for 3 years," he said. Not quite an accusation, a statement delivered in the shape of one. "I've been working for 3 years," I said. "That's not the same thing." He told me I had taken a family matter and made it external. That there were internal ways to raise concerns, that I had created damage to relationships to the company's standing in the market that would take time to repair. "I didn't restructure $2.8 million through a freight company your brother owns," I said. "I documented it. Legally, from public records. You keep describing my response to the problem as though it is the problem." He tried a different approach then, the one people like him reach for when the first angle doesn't hold. He listed things he'd done. Supporting my VP appointment, he said, before he'd had reason to question my judgment. As if those were gifts and not calculations made when it still served him to have me managing operations rather than sitting in governance. As if I hadn't understood, even at the time, exactly what those placements were for. "Family forgives," he said finally. "That's what family does." "You stood in a boardroom and told people I wasn't serious enough to be trusted with the company my father built," I said. "You taught me that family doesn't protect a seat at the table. I was slower to believe you than you expected. That's the only mistake I made." He left without another word. As far as I know, we will not have another conversation of any substance. The audit ran 11 weeks. The logistics contracts were terminated. The financial obligations were unwound through a settlement the remaining board negotiated with outside legal counsel. My uncle's brother's company filed to dissolve its Ontario registration before the audit's preliminary findings were formally published. A lawsuit my uncle briefly threatened against the board was withdrawn, according to the corporate lawyer, after his own counsel advised him that pursuing it would require the kind of financial transparency that served no one involved. Staff who had been quietly updating their resumes began to stay. My cousin was promoted to controller. 3 of the account managers who had left in the previous 2 years were approached, and 2 of them came back. The board asked if I would return as chief operating officer 3 months after the audit closed. I said yes, on one condition, that the succession framework my father had outlined informally. in the way of a man who trusted that certain things didn't require documentation, be formalized in a shareholder agreement. Signed, witnessed, filed properly. I was not willing to build again on a foundation that existed only in goodwill and memory. It was done before spring. My grandfather's old partner made sure of it before he retired from the board for good. The morning I came back, I went in through the loading dock. Not for any reason I had planned. It was simply where I'd always started mornings when the building felt like mine. The early operational noise of it, the cold air off the bay doors, the specific organized motion of a distribution facility at the beginning of its day. The account managers I'd worked alongside before I left were mostly still there. We didn't mark the occasion. There was a full day ahead, and everyone in the building knew what the work required. My uncle told a room full of people that I wasn't built for hard decisions. That sentiment would cloud my judgment. That the company needed someone to separate the personal from the operational. What I know now, and what I think he understood somewhere even then, is that he was misidentifying the quality he was actually afraid of. He wasn't afraid I was too emotional. He was afraid I was too patient. That I would watch and document and wait, and then act at exactly the moment when everything I had prepared meant more than anything he had done. He was right to be afraid of that. He just moved first because he thought speed was the advantage. It wasn't. It never was. It was the 42 pages that Preeti handed me in a Waterloo office on a rainy afternoon. It was 3 years of credentials no one could dismiss. It was the choice, made dozens of times across those years, to wait one more week, to be certain one more time, to build one more layer of documentation onto a case that would simply be too thorough to argue with. My grandfather built this company for 30 years. My father built it for 22 more. I didn't inherit what they left. I earned my place in it the only way that turned out to be available to me. On paper, in numbers, through 4 months of documented fact that told the story better than any argument I could have made from anger or grief, or the particular injury of being voted out of a room I had spent a decade learning to deserve. That, in the end, was worth more than anything anyone could have promised me at 31.